Behind every story is a world of twists and turns, secrets waiting to be uncovered, and mysteries begging to be solved. I'm Mr. Wilder. Let's dive into today's story and uncover what lies in the shadows. The Zodiac Killer. On the night of December 20th, 1968, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen parked their car on a remote lover's lane on Lake Herman Road in Vallejo, California. The area was known for its secluded spots and romantic views of the lake. As they sat in the car, a gunman emerged from the darkness and approached the vehicle. The gunman fired multiple shots into the car, striking both David and Betty Lou. David, who was driving, was shot in the head and died instantly. Betty Lou, who was sitting in the passenger seat, was shot in the neck and died a short time later. The gunman then fled the scene, leaving behind a trail of blood and shell casings. The police were called to the scene, and they arrived to find the two teenagers dead in the car. The killing scene was a gruesome and disturbing sight, with blood and shell casings scattered everywhere. The police took careful note of the evidence, including the type of gun used and the direction of the shots. The police investigation into the killings began immediately, with detectives collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses. However, despite their best efforts, the police were unable to find any leads on the killer's identity. As the investigation continued, the police began to realize that the killings were not just a random act of violence. The killer had deliberately targeted the two teenagers and had carefully planned and executed the crime. On a hot summer evening on July 4, 1969, Michael Mageau, 19, and Darlene Ferrin, 22, had decided to spend the evening together, parked in a car on a remote road in Vallejo, California. As they sat in the car, a gunman emerged from the darkness and began firing. Michael and Darlene were shot and wounded, but they managed to escape the scene and flagged down a passing car for help. The police were called to the scene, and they arrived to find Michael and Darlene wounded, but alive. The police investigation into the shooting began immediately, with detectives collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses. As the police investigated the shooting, they began to suspect that it might be linked to the double homicide of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, which had occurred several months earlier. The police were still investigating the earlier killings when they received a letter from the killer, claiming responsibility for the shooting of Michael and Darlene. The letter was sent to the Vallejo Times-Herald on July 31, 1969, and it included a cryptic message and a drawing of a crosshair symbol. The letter read, "I am the killer of the two teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman. I am the same man who did the shooting in Vallejo a few nights ago." The police were shocked by the letter, and they immediately began to investigate the killer's claims. As they investigated, they realized that the killer had deliberately left behind certain clues, while carefully removing others. The police found a 9mm shell casing at the scene of the shooting, which suggested that the killer had used a 9mm handgun. However, despite the presence of the shell casing, the police were unable to find any fingerprints or other physical evidence that could be linked to the killer. The lack of physical evidence at the crime scene was a major obstacle for the police. Without any concrete leads, they were forced to rely on eyewitness accounts and other circumstantial evidence. One of the most promising leads in the case came from a witness who reported seeing a man in a white car driving away from the scene of the crime. However, despite an extensive search, the police were unable to find any white cars that matched the witness's description. As the investigation continued, the police began to receive reports of other suspicious incidents in the area. Several people reported seeing a man in a white car driving around the neighborhood, and one woman even reported being followed by a man in a white car. Despite these reports, the police were unable to find any concrete evidence linking the incidents to the killer. The case remained a mystery, and the police were no closer to catching the killer, but the killer was not finished yet. He would go on to commit several more murders, and would taunt the police with letters and cryptic messages. On July 31, 1969, the Zodiac Killer sent a letter to the Vallejo Times-Herald, claiming responsibility for the shooting of Michael Mageau and Darlene Ferrin. The letter included a cryptic message and a drawing of a crosshair symbol. But what really caught the attention of the police and the public was the inclusion of a cryptogram, which the Zodiac Killer claimed would reveal his identity. The cryptogram, known as the 408 cipher, consisted of 408 symbols, arranged in a complex pattern. The Zodiac Killer claimed that the cipher would reveal his identity, But despite the best efforts of cryptographers and code breakers, the meaning behind the cipher remains a mystery. The 408 cipher was a clever move by the Zodiac Killer, as it allowed him to taunt the police and the public while remaining anonymous. The cipher also sparked a wave of interest in cryptography and code breaking, as people around the world tried to crack the code. But it was in this same letter that the Zodiac Killer first referred to himself by his infamous nickname. He signed the letter with a symbol, a cross inside a circle, and wrote the word Zodiac Killer in bold block letters. The name Zodiac Killer was quickly picked up by the media, and it soon became synonymous with the unknown killer who was terrorizing the San Francisco Bay Area. The Zodiac Killer's use of the Zodiac name and symbol was likely a deliberate attempt to create a sense of mystery and intrigue around his crimes. By adopting a name for himself and a distinctive symbol, the killer was able to create a sense of persona and identity that has endured long after his crimes were committed. Despite the lack of progress in cracking the 408 cipher, the police remained hopeful that it would eventually lead them to the killer. They continued to investigate the Zodiac Killer's crimes, following up on leads and interviewing witnesses. But the Zodiac Killer remained one step ahead, always seeming to be in control. He would continue to send letters and cryptic messages to the police and the public, always staying just out of reach. On October 11, 1969, the Zodiac Killer struck again, this time in San Francisco. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old taxi driver, had just finished a fare in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. He was driving his taxi, a 1966 Checker Marathon, down Mason Street when he picked up a passenger. The passenger, who was later determined to be the Zodiac Killer, asked to be taken to the intersection of Washington and Maple Streets. As they approached the intersection, the passenger suddenly pulled out a gun and shot Stein in the head. The killer then got out of the taxi and walked around to the driver's side, where he shot Stein again in the head. The killer then took a piece of Stein's shirt and ripped it off, leaving it at the scene. He also took Stein's wallet and keys and then walked away from the scene, disappearing into the night. The police were called to the scene, and they arrived to find Stein's body slumped over the wheel of his taxi. The police investigation into Stein's murder was extensive, but it ultimately proved to be fruitless. The killer was never caught, and the case remains one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. The Zodiac Killer's killing of Paul Stein marked the end of his confirmed killing spree, but it also marked the beginning of a new era of terror, as the killer continued to send letters and cryptic messages to the police and the public. In the days that followed, the Zodiac Killer sent a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, claiming responsibility for Stein's murder. The letter included a piece of Stein's shirt, which the killer had ripped off during the attack. The Zodiac Killer's killing spree may have ended with the murder of Paul Stein, but his reign of terror was far from over. In the months and years that followed, the killer continued to send letters and cryptic messages to the police and the public. One of the most notable letters sent by the Zodiac Killer was the Z340 letter, which was sent to the San Francisco Chronicle in November 1969. This letter included a cryptogram, which the killer claimed would reveal his identity. The cryptogram was a complex code that consisted of 340 symbols, arranged in a series of rows and columns. Despite the best efforts of cryptographers and code breakers, the meaning behind the cipher remains a mystery. In addition to the cryptogram, the Z340 letter also included a threatening message, in which the killer claimed to have killed 7 people and threatened to kill more unless his demands were met. The letter was sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, and it was received by the newspaper on November 8, 1969. The letter was immediately turned over to the police, who began to analyze it for clues. Over the next few months, the Zodiac Killer sent several more letters to the police and the public. Each letter was more taunting and menacing than the last, and they all seemed to be designed to tease and frustrate the police. In one letter, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle in March 1970, the Zodiac Killer claimed to have killed 10 people and threatened to kill more unless his demands were met. The letter also included a drawing of a knife, which the killer claimed was the same knife he had used to kill his victims. The Zodiac Killer's letters continued to arrive over the next few years, each one more taunting and menacing than the last. The killer seemed to take great pleasure in teasing the police and the public, always staying one step ahead of his pursuers. As the letters continued to arrive, the police and the public were left to wonder, who was the Zodiac Killer, and what drove him to commit such heinous crimes? In 1971, the Zodiac Killer sent his final confirmed letter to the San Francisco Chronicle. The letter was brief and to the point, and it simply stated that the killer had moved to the East Coast and would no longer be killing in California. The letter was received by the San Francisco Chronicle on January 29, 1971, and it was immediately turned over to the police. Despite the killer's claims to have moved to the East Coast, the police continued to investigate the Zodiac Killer's crimes, and they remained on the lookout for any new leads or clues. The Zodiac Killer's case is one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer cases in American history. Over the years, numerous suspects have been identified and investigated, but none of them have been proven conclusively to be the killer. One of the most notable suspects was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who was identified as a potential suspect in the early 1970s. Allen's fingerprints were compared to the fingerprints found on the Zodiac Killer's letters, but they did not match. Despite the lack of a fingerprint match, the police continued to investigate Allen, and they eventually searched his home. The search of Allen's home turned up several pieces of evidence that suggested he may have been the Zodiac Killer, including a pair of glasses that were similar to the glasses worn by the Zodiac Killer in a composite sketch. However, despite the discovery of this evidence, Allen was never charged with the Zodiac Killer's crimes. He died in 1992, and the police officially cleared him as a suspect in 2002. Another suspect who was identified and investigated was Richard Gaikowski, a journalist and editor who was identified as a potential suspect in the 1980s. Gaikowski's writing style and handwriting were compared to the Zodiac Killer's letters, and some experts believe that they matched. Despite the similarities in writing style and handwriting, Gaikowski was never charged with the Zodiac Killer's crimes. He died in 2004, and the police officially cleared him as a suspect in 2007. Theodore Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, was another suspect who was identified and investigated. Kaczynski's writing style and handwriting were compared to the Zodiac Killer's letters, and some experts believed that they matched. However, despite the similarities in writing style and handwriting, Kaczynski was never charged with the Zodiac Killer's crimes. He was arrested in 1996 and convicted of numerous federal charges related to his domestic terrorism activities. Despite the numerous suspects who have been identified and investigated over the years, the Zodiac Killer's true identity remains a mystery. The case continues to be one of the most infamous, unsolved serial killer cases in American history. That's all for this video. If you like this kind of content, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the bell icon so you won't miss any of my uploads. I'm Mr. Wilder, and I'll see you on the next video.